Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Relational Life Community Conversation Series, presented by the Relational Life Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to bringing more relational ways of living to individuals, couples, families, and communities through relational life therapy. My name is Sarah Oswald, and I'm the director of the Relational Life Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us today. Sorry for the late beginning. This panel presentation will examine why shame resilience matters in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Looking at shame is essential in acknowledging and unpacking privilege and power. When something has not been given a voice, there is always an undertone of shame. If left unexamined, shame can show up as defensiveness and keep us stuck in a powerless place. This conversation will highlight tools from relational life therapy, which you may hear referred to as RLT, that can be used to support us in being resilient in the face of shameful feelings and in stepping further into our full relational power. So, a few technical details. As you sign in, please use the chat to introduce yourself. Tell us where you are. We will be turning off the chat, the public chat, once the event officially begins, mainly to avoid distraction to our panelists. However, we will be accepting questions through the Q&A feature, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be taken live at the end of our time together, or I might come on and read a question, but feel free to submit them throughout the event on the Q&A. And we ask that you please keep your comments and questions respectful and kind. You can also contact Tyler, our technical support, through this Q&A feature. This conversation is being recorded, and it will be made available for purchase on the Foundation's website after the event, once it's edited. The proceeds of all the sales, these are donations, will go towards supporting us to host similar events in this series down the road. So if you enjoy this talk, we'd so appreciate it if you'd share it with anyone else that you think might benefit from it. We have with us today two ASL interpreters, Beth and Derek. They will be assisting us with interpreting for the deaf community. We are so glad the two of you could join us. And lastly, I'd like to introduce our host, Duran Young. Duran is a licensed therapist specializing in racial trauma and legacy burdens. She is a co-author of the New York Times bestseller, You Are Your Best Thing. She's a retired military officer, and she's the founder of Black Therapists Rock, which is a nonprofit organization committed to reducing the psychological impact of systemic oppression and intergenerational trauma. Black Therapists Rock happens to be partners of ours, the Relational Life Foundation, and we're currently planning an RLT Relationship Skills Bootcamp for the Black Therapists Rock members in Washington, D.C. next month. So if you're listening to this and you're a BTR member, and if you've been considering joining, it's not too late to sign up for that event. Duran will be joined today by three panelists. Terry Reel, who has been a panelist on every one of these. He joins Duran today again. He's an internationally recognized family therapist, speaker, and author. Terry founded the Relational Life Institute, offering workshops for couples, individuals, and parents around the country, along with a professional training program for clinicians wanting to learn his relational life therapy methodology. Terry is a best-selling author, a family therapist, and has been a teacher for more than 25 years. We also have with us today Dr. Michelle Rodriguez. Michelle is a psychologist and founder of Collaborative Changemakers. She has served as the president of the Metro Detroit chapter of the Association of Black Psychologists. And Michelle specializes in Black mental health and wellness, trauma, and helping people excel in high achievement settings. As a speaker, trainer, and author, Dr. Rodriguez loves to integrate art and pop culture and bringing community together for discussions that cultivate healing and growth, perhaps much like this one. And lastly, we have Rebecca Ching. Rebecca is a licensed marriage and family therapist, a leadership developer, writer, speaker, and the host of the Unburdened Leader podcast. Unburdened leadership is the work Rebecca has honed for leaders and entrepreneurs to have greater impact and legacy by navigating the intersection of mind and mental health, mindset and mental health. Unburdened leadership coaching is informed by her extensive training in systems theory, trauma-informed practices, the research of Brené Brown, and internal family systems. I would like to thank each one of you for joining us in this discussion on shame resilience. And a special thank you to Duran for leading this discussion on such an important topic. I'm thrilled all 4 of you are here with us. I invite you to turn on your videos and microphones.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, everybody. Great to be here.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome. And there's Duran. Wonderful. Glad you made it, Duran. So sorry for the technical difficulties getting you in here. Thank you all for being here. I hope you have a wonderful conversation. I will chime in toward the end, bringing on some questions. So let me know when you're ready for that at about half an hour till the end.
Thank you, Sarah.
See you soon.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. We are going to be having a conversation here. It's going to truly be a conversation today. In the past, we've had more of a presentation to start with, but for this particular topic, we thought it might be a better idea to just talk, to just relate and connect on a human level with each other as a collective and as people who are really passionate about being the change we want to see in the world. So I want to first start with, we're going to have a video here soon. And as Sarah said, we will try to leave time at the end for you all to also ask questions. But we want to start today's conversation with just kind of a framing of understanding the intersection of shame resilience or shame in general as it relates to relational life therapy. So Terry, I was wondering if maybe we could just start with you today. I know that's different than what we've done in the past, but I think this is a great conversation to kind of have relationally, and since your framework and your model really speaks to that approach, I thought we'd maybe start there.
Oh, that's great, Drew. It's wonderful to see you and be with you again, by the way. And it's great to be with our panelists. Yeah, RLT has a lot to say about shame. We've been talking about shame for, upwards of 30 years. Shame is the one down. It's feeling less than, defective, unlovable, like there's something wrong with you. We work psychotherapy for 50 years has worked to help people come up from that one down of shame into healthy self-esteem. Healthy self-esteem is feeling good about yourself, being able to hold yourself in warm regard, and yet feel proportionately bad about bad behavior at the same time. It's a distinction good parents use with our kids. You're a good kid, get that hammer out of your hand. So you feel bad about the bad behavior proportionately, but you still hold yourself in warm regard as a flawed person. Shame is a personal attack. I'm a bad person. I'm a shit. I'm less than. And I think RLT is really unique in that we focus on what I like to call the other self-esteem disorder, which is superiority, grandiosity, not one down, but one up. And I wrote a book about men back in the 90s, and I think it's really central to masculinity, but not exclusive to men, that there's often a bounce. You go from shame, feeling impotent, abandoned, less than, defective, up into superiority, entitlement, grandiosity. You go from feeling helpless to attack. These are, I think, the psychological roots of much violence in the world, certainly masculine violence. Abusers are most dangerous when they feel like their partners are moving away from them. They go into abandonment, and then right from there up into grandiosity and control and attack. And what's devilish about that move is that grandiosity works. It self-medicates. You feel better in the short run, just like any other intoxication, but it creates havoc in your life. So RLT works with both ends of this, helping someone come up from shame and helping someone come down from grandiosity into what? And here I tip my hat to Brene Brown, into guilt. I used to call it healthy shame versus toxic shame. Forget it after Brene, shame's a bad word. And so now I speak of shame versus guilt. Remorse. Remorse is healing. Shame is not. And the deal, what I say, what we are afraid of often as therapists in confronting somebody who's in the one-up position is they'll move from inflation to deflation. They'll move from grandiosity into shame. What we fear as therapists and coaches is what women fear with men, which is that if we tell truth to power, if we dare tell the truth, the grandiose person will either attack us, they'll fly into a rage, or they'll run away and leave us, including storming out of the room and leaving the therapy, or they'll fall apart and we will have hurt them. These are under patriarchy, what inhibits women from standing up to men, these three fears. And they're not stupid fears. We're not afraid of any of that. We use leverage to keep the person in the seat. And if they do move into shame, we teach them how to move out of it. We say, when you move from shameless entitlement into toxic shame, I'm a shitty person. You move from one form of self-preoccupation, I can do whatever I want, to guess what? A different form of self-preoccupation. I'm a big shit, I should go somewhere and die. You're not doing anybody any favors. Remorse and guilt moves you out to the person you hurt. What can I do for you? How can I make amends to you? It's what my kids would call get over yourself. And if I'm sitting with a client and they move from inflation to deflation, I watch them go into shame, I'll teach them how to get out of it. Look, it's hard to get out of shame. I'll give you 60 seconds. Now go ahead, turn to your partner and see what they need. And people do. So we're not afraid of the patriarchal sort of boogeymen that frighten people from telling the truth to grandiosity. And we deal with both ends. The other thing the other thing to say, obviously, is that being shamed is an intrinsic trauma for all marginalized people. Not to whatever, but I love Toni Morrison's book, Beloved. And after she catalogs hundreds of pages of horrible, unthinkable abuse, what you feel as you get this ghost who's hanging around, who can't leave, is that what's unsettled in her is the deepest wound of all, which is just not being loved, not being welcome on this earth. And what Toni Morrison did to me in that moment was drive home that just being marginalized, being one down, is the greatest trauma that you can inflict on someone psychologically. And all of the rest is more blatant and more bloody. But the simple act of not being wanted on this earth is horrible to be on the receiving end of, and intrinsic trauma for all marginalized groups. So to be marginalized means to be shamed. And there is no escape from internalizing that shame to some degree and having to lean into it and learn how to fight it. RLT has specific tools to help people move from the one down of shame up. And we can talk more about that. But I'm really thrilled as the creator of RLT to bring some of the wisdom and skills we know about relationship, including relationship to ourselves, to bear on this collective wound of race and marginalization. How's that for now?
That was a great start. Some of the things that you said that really stood out to me, I was thinking about, or I was visualizing really, and when you were saying, marginalized people, but even before you were saying that, I was just thinking systemic oppression or systemic marginalization really polarizes us into one up and one down. So we all are kind of living that whether we know it or not. And often it's very invisible, very unconscious, very much in our blind spots that we don't see it unless you're actively and intentionally wanting to see it, really, for me, especially as someone who lived in shame most of my life as a dark-skinned Black woman in the South. I didn't want to see all of the pain and the hurt, kind of like what you described in Toni Morrison's book / film. I can very much relate to that. I know it's a very popular movie among many African Americans, but that knowing that you're not wanted, that knowing that you're not the preferred, you're not empowered, you're not, even as a woman, I think about the Barbie movie that I've been ranting and raving about recently. That was kind of like a celebration of all things feminine to me, all things soft, all things creative, all things wild, all things fun, dance and fashion. And I really, really enjoyed it. And it's like, wow, women haven't really been celebrated in our society. That's what that pointed out to me. At the same time, they unpacked the whole concept of patriarchy and how men have really been benefiting for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of years since the beginning of time, maybe, because of the physical power that men have, and how women's power has been undervalued. So I want to turn to Rebecca now and kind of get your perspective. I know we've talked about a lot of big things already, but I know that you've been working under Brene Brown's curriculum, like myself, for many years now. That's kind of how we met, or how we kind of bonded more, I will say. We'd already known each other from a different modality, but I know that you're a leader like myself. You've also got lots of great government experience, which I'm really fond of as a former military officer myself. So we related on a lot of things. And I'm really curious to hear how Brene's work and studying her message and modality, how has that shaped your perspectives on leadership and healing in general?
Gosh, foundationally, and great to be with you all. I love this conversation. Yeah, it's become foundational. I think so many of us in helping professions, we learn tips and tricks and ways to help our clients. But the research and methodologies that Brene Brown has offered is a way of living, a way of seeing, a way of relating. It's a part of my DNA now. And I think at the heart of it too is the values piece. And I don't know about many of you, but before coming into this work, I'd hear a lot of talk about values and things that are posted on the walls, and they always just felt disconnected. And I realized in Brene's research and her work how foundational values were to moving through my capacity for vulnerability, which Brene defines as risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. And I want to pause on that briefly because a lot of folks talk about vulnerability, but if you're in vulnerability, there's nothing comfortable about it. So just a heads up. If you're like, I was so vulnerable, I'm like, yeah, I don't think so. And I often talk about what I've learned from Brene's work is that where vulnerability is, and it's the path to all the things that I value and that I desire in my own life and in those around me and the world I live in, right below vulnerability kind of is like blood in the water to shame, and kind of circles like a shark below that bridge of vulnerability that we're asked to cross. And helping discern the difference of that activation that my nervous system hates of vulnerability, that risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. Like, I don't know anyone's like, yay, vulnerability. No, but I have a deep now reverence for it, a deep commitment to it. And I can now differentiate when I'm in vulnerability, because it's usually up around the things I care most about, my work, people I support, my family, my faith, the world we're in, and shame, where all of a sudden I'm in a place saying, I'm terrible. Who do I think I am to do this? Or who do you think you are? I'm in the shaming outward mode. And so even just discerning that, but at the heart of this was realizing we can have all of this language, this incredible language that Brené's given us, RLT's given us. But if I can't sit with it in my body and have the capacity for it, so there's this commitment to just doing the reps with my clients, my leadership coaching clients, to do the reps to help them increase their capacity for vulnerability. And then when shame comes up, because shame is part of the whole human condition, a lot of people will say hashtag no shame. And I tell my clients that that's a lobotomy, because it's part of the human condition. Or I don't do vulnerability, which is also a lobotomy, because if you love, Brené's taught us, then you're vulnerable. And I joke and say the folks that don't experience vulnerability are sociopaths and zombies, and I don't work with either. And I have like a real like weird reoccurring like zombie fear, which we can unpack offline, but very vulnerable. Made the mistake of watching some weird zombie movie when I was pregnant with my first kid. My husband said, "Oh, it's no big deal. It's all fake." Yeah, no, it's not fake. It's real. It's scary. I digress. But this work is so foundational. If we don't have an understanding of where shame and how shame shows up in our body, in our relationships, and in our life, it will take us out and it will win. It will. And then you bring in conversations around race, which is particularly someone in a white body is ground zero to vulnerability. And if the different parts of our nervous system try to protect and move away from vulnerability, we are going to end up probably leading from shame and doing harm, not just to ourselves, but more importantly to others in that process. If there's anything else you want me to keep riffing on. But I guess
I'm really interested to hear you talk more about what do you mean by harm? Because I think there's a lot of well-intended people who cause a lot of harm every day. I witness this. And like they don't realize what they're in a power over dynamic, or that what their ask is too big for the person that they're talking to. They don't socially locate themselves, as Terry said earlier, that it's really important for us to socially locate ourselves. And so what do you mean by the harm that happens when we don't do that?
Well, I started seeing again and again in my office these incredible folks who were leading businesses, education, nonprofits, and they were face down again and again saying, I can't figure these things out. Why am I struggling? And why are other people attacking me all the time? Why can't everyone get it together? And I realized that I just want to name that there's a lot of teachings out there that want us to think through our discomfort, and we have to feel through it. And that's a deep commitment. That's a mind-body commitment. And so if we are in a place where we are feeling threatened, we're going to protect. And sometimes we think and then you intersect whiteness into this and the burden of racism. There's a lot of folks, and it took me a while to realize how much I can move through these places. I can tap out and not speak up in a conversation. I can get defensive. I can get overwhelmed. I can blame. I can other when shame is showing up. And because of the identities I hold, the privileged identities I hold, I am piling on to the harm that has been done, not just for an individual's life, but generationally. And even if we don't get to decide what our impact is, we get to commit to our intent. And what Brené's Shame Resilience has helped me is realize, even when my intent and I've thought through something, I still have an impact that does harm. It's helped me have the conversation to stay in curiosity. And as Terry talked about, in a place to be in relational repair, and to care for myself and not burden the person who was harmed as I'm dealing with my shame and my vulnerability. And so there's a lot of boundaries involved with that. And again, a lot of my values. So the harm is done is when I do harm, I get in trouble. I feel like I get in trouble when someone says, ouch, not okay. Someone's actually calling me up for accountability. And if shame moves in and I'm leading from a place of shame, then I am going to, which Brene defines it as the intensely painful feeling or fear of not being worthy of love and belonging. So then if I am dehumanizing in my response, even if I don't believe it, then I'm just continuing, I'm colluding with what's going on in our culture. But if I can sit with what comes up in me, the vulnerability of I'm messed up, and knowing that my worthiness isn't on the table here. Now, and that's a tough one. We are all, this is what Brene's work is taught, our worth and our worthiness of love and belonging isn't up for negotiation. It doesn't have an expiration date. And if I believe that, even when I've done harm and I've hurt someone, I've offended, I've done a big breach in a relationship, how do I stay present with the vulnerability and the conviction for me of, ooh, and am I resourced to navigate that without further burdening the person I've harmed? But I can hold a place of listening and curiosity. And this is the work. And there's nothing tidy about it, nothing efficient about it. And power over loves to breeze through these things. And power over defines all of this inefficient and ridiculously slow and not profitable. and so yeah, so to be committed to really honoring the humanity in me and in someone else in the messiness of it, and keeping my worth off the table and understanding what's mine and still stay in a place of curiosity. Shame resilience has been essential in that work, and it's an honor to help others develop that too.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives on that. That was great. Now, Michelle, I'm really excited because I know we trained together. I trained you, I think, in Dare to Lead, and you were saying some really great things. And I was like, I want to work with her. I want her to, be on a bigger stage and a bigger platform to say these things. So I'm really glad to have you here today. I know that you do a lot of DEI work, specifically in healthcare, if I have it correct. No.
Actually, in different spaces, a lot of times in universities and in different nonprofits and orgs like that.
Okay. And I remember when we were talking through Dare to Lead and we talked about armor, what I always, think of is intellect for a lot of smart people that, especially in universities and leaders and nonprofit organizations. And I was thinking in healthcare settings when I was working in hospitals for almost 20 years in the military. And when you're talking to really smart people, intellect can be one of our primary armors, even for myself. That's something that I realized that if I'm feeling vulnerable, if I study it and I go read a book, then I can check the box and say, I know it. And then I feel better, right? So often in DEI spaces, people are looking for a checklist. They're looking for a book. They're looking for something, intellectual. And I will always tell people that you have to be a learner, not a knower. And of course, that pushes us back into vulnerability. And we don't want that, like Rebecca said. So we need some armor. We often pull up, just our unconscious learned defense mechanisms. In RLT, they call it the adaptive child, the way that we learn to navigate our emotions, our overwhelming experience when we were a child is typically how we show up in these adult conversations as well. So I'm wondering, you can tell us a little bit about your DEI work and how some common patterns that you've seen as far as armoring, when people tend to armor up and what that looks like.
Yeah, so trying to think of where to start in that question. I think I'll start where my brain is just kind of still chewing on a little bit. The metaphor to me that Rebecca used of zombies, I think that shame really gets us operating like zombies. It gets us operating in these very automatic ways that are not rooted and grounded in the here and now, that are not in our bodies. And I think we have these habits, these tools, these ways that we go to protect us that are really automatic. I mean, mindless. It takes nothing to move into them, to use these strategies. And so it becomes almost predictable. If we study ourselves, we will see how we show up in spaces when race, when vulnerability, when DEI topics get brought up. But also as a facilitator, you kind of just start to see the same things happen over and over and over again. And so I think one thing that I love about Brene's work is that I think it puts us all on this even playing field. We are all that's even kind of a weird term to use when we start talking about race, but we are all human. We are all experiencing shame. We're coming at it from different angles, but we all really need to be aware of what's happening in our bodies and what our go-to strategies are. So for me, I think it's really helpful the way that Brené talks about shame shields. Like, to me, these are like these body habits, and everybody has them. So when I'm in a conversation, when I'm facilitating in a space and we start talking about what the problems are, when we start having disagreements, when we start thinking about changes that would make people uncomfortable, somebody says something in the room, when all the air leaves the room, what does my body do? You know, and Brené kind of has her three, like, move against. I want to fight or fight the problem or a person, or, you know, like I want to lean in that way. I want to flee the room. So either I just check out, you know, and I'm checking my phone, or I'm looking at my watch, or I want to leave. I'm shutting down. Or I start trying to over accommodate, get small, pacify. And I think knowing that all of us have those things is helpful, because it allows me, I think, like Rebecca was talking about, to find it in my body. It's like my poker tell, what I have been activated in this situation. And I really love Reza Minikim's work too, because I think it says that in our DEI work, we are often talking about information. Like you said, we are often thinking through, trying to explain new theories. Let's look at the data and all of this stuff. While it informs and is important, doesn't bring us into the vulnerable, sticky, messy thing that is often happening in the moment. And when we can learn to talk about that, breathe through it, find our body strategies to meet each other there in real time, I think that real change can happen. But I think we can see the armor that that comes up, the strategies that are almost predictable. People run up into their heads and start over-explaining, rationalizing, playing devil's advocate for no reason. Like, somebody had a really good point that we could really stick with and stay there. But we're running around in our brain doing all of these intellectual games that distance us from the problem at hand. You see people start taking up a ton of space and really centering their especially when we hold privilege in our identities, centering their thoughts, their ways of being, their feelings, as a way that, again, moves us away from the problem. And I think when we can see it happening in ourselves, when we as facilitators can see it happening, we can slow it down. We can invite each other to notice and invite each other, like Terry was saying, to, in the moment, do something different, create something different. A couple more that I'll just say that I notice a lot is that, I mean, I think perfectionism, like that we've been talking about this, like, I need to get it just right. And when we acknowledge that that's not likely to happen, that this is a complex problem, and that we're going to kind of hopefully fail forward, we're going to mistake forward, we're going to learn together in real time. When we normalize that, conflict is just a human thing. Disagreement is a human thing. And it doesn't have to be a lose-lose. That if we can stay in it, if we can develop those physics, we can get through it. I think that really helps. But most of us, that's not our lived experience. And so we've learned that we have to hide ourselves or attack or defend. And the last two that I'll just point out that happens a lot in organizations. Organizations, they need to be practical, and I get that. But I think sometimes even being practical is another way of intellectualizing, because you can really quickly say, well, we don't know if we can change this. You know, this has been here forever. Our organization may not be able to figure that out. And I think even that is a way of shutting down process, protecting the status quo, protecting people who aren't used to being uncomfortable or aren't used to having to give up anything or compromise. And when we drop down into our bodies and really stay with the harm and the damage, I think we insist this change has to happen. We create a space where creativity and reimagining can happen, where it doesn't have to be scarcity and, you know, a zero-sum game. And the last one, I think, is just in an age where people are leaving DEI right and left. I think some of us numb as facilitators by burying ourselves almost in the work, not being in our bodies, not attending to our own care. almost taking in more information, scrolling that we can even process or hold or do anything about. And I think that this work needs us to be embodied, needs us to practice letting in joy, practice not numbing, like how am I taking care of myself in the work? How am I taking care of myself after the work? What support do I need? Am I in the role that I need to be in this season of my life? I think all of this, when we look at the shields, when we look at the armor that we put on, it invites us to really breathe, slow down, and say, what am I doing? Is it working? As a facilitator, as a participant, as anybody coming to this trying to create change.
That was so spot on, Michelle. Everything you said. One of the things that came to mind as you were talking about armor and intellectualism or intellectualizing is this idea that we don't even know oftentimes that we're doing it, and it can be really sneaky and hard to look at. And it made me think of 12 steps. So that's kind of how I got to 12 steps, as through a Workaholism Anonymous. So I was one of those people who was spinning, especially during the time of the George Floyd murder. I was really like, what can I do? What can I do? How can I know, everything I need to know to be the best DEI person possible? How can I be the best advocate for all people? How can I be, how can I just be more and do more and know more? And so I didn't even, what they say in 12 steps, denial stands for didn't even notice I am lying. Or don't even notice I am lying. So I didn't notice I was lying. I didn't notice that intellectualism was a form of armor for me. And I think that's true for most people. But when we're in relationships, right? Relationships give us an opportunity to really look at some of the things that we could easily just ignore when we're on our own. And I also think that that's kind of what breeds isolation. When you're stuck in that place of shame and you feel covered and buried under it, you don't want anyone to see you. You feel like you're not worthy of connection. And so in 12 steps, we say that shame stands for should have already mastered everything. And when I find myself, I can find myself, like you said, Rebecca, it's a real-time practice. It's like, oh, what am I doing here? And I've taken on self-compassion as a really good tool for me to remind myself that I'm worthy of the grace that I give everyone else, especially a lot of us as caregivers and, professional helpers, therapists, coaches, leaders, et cetera. We can give and give and give and give. And we haven't realized that we're not taking up space for ourselves. That to me, shame resilience is about taking up space, expressing your needs, your boundaries, your values, as Rebecca said. So knowing that I'm never going to have mastered everything, but I'm still worthy of taking up space wherever I am. So to me, that's what belonging is. We're all worthy. That's the gag. We're all worthy of taking up space. So Rebecca, take up space.
Well, I want to say, though, that for folks who are in white bodies, taking up space is just something that we've done. And so I want to just have a little caveat in that to get curious about it, because sometimes we can default into what's fair, what's equal, all of those things that privilege and power have entitled. And those are hard rumbles to reckon with. It brings up a lot of, but what about? And but aren't we all? And having a place to talk about what that brings up, that me taking up space, depending on the room, is gonna look really different. And I want to just name it. If I'm in a room where I just have to be sensitive to anyone who doesn't hold the same identities to me, and that it was a little jarring because of the privileges and the identities I hold back, and just again moving in and out without worrying about safety in a lot of instances. So I guess, just there's that piece about taking up space first has to what's entitled and what is just owning my story. And am I taking up space in a way that is in any way diminishing the dignity of others? And that space to there can sometimes it's a road to travel for folks who haven't had to think about that. And if anyone is in a leadership or helping position, I think we need to be looking at that. And it comes with owning our worthiness. The more that we really own our worthiness and also stay curious about others and how they're doing that, we're not responsible for, but just stay in a place of curiosity feels really important. So just wanted to name that as you were talking about taking up space.
And I think what you do with the space, right? I had to realize as a cis het woman, as a woman I have a lot of privileges, dating heterosexually, that other people, marginalized people don't have. And I had to realize that I can still take up space and use that space to invite more people in, to have more inclusion, to have more belonging. So that's been the really beautiful thing, especially as a marginalized person, to honor the space that I'm in and to honor the power that I have within my own experience. So I love what you said, Rebecca, and I thought that was a great example, actually, of taking up space to say, advocating still for other people who may not be able to take up that space as easily or as boldly. So I agree. I always say we use our privilege and our power for good, not harm. And there you have to know the difference between the two. If you're not conscious, if you're not constantly aware, almost, it's like it's really easy to slip right into that harmful behavior. So we want to go to our video now. It's going to talk a little bit about white privilege, as well as unpacking shame and guilt, which Terry briefly touched on a little bit. But in terms of the difference between shame and guilt, what I want you to pay attention to with the video, how she moves from shame to guilt as a white woman studying race. But I would say that guilt is more helpful, actually, because guilt is about behavior. It's externalizing out of who you are as a person, out of your worthiness, taking worthiness off the table, as Rebecca said, and just looking at the behavior objectively and with, openness and curiosity. So we'll go ahead and watch the video. When we come back, we're also going to talk about specific strategies that RLT has when it comes to working with shame. We're just going to keep this conversation going, basically. So look forward to that. I can invite the panelists to turn their cameras off if they're not wanting to be stared at while we watch the video, and we'll be right back afterwards.
Yeah, cringeworthy. So I think I'm part of the agitate part of today's program. 7 years ago, I had a series of wake-up calls that were so profound. That was in this course, Racial and Cultural Identities, that Mina just told us about. These awakenings were so profound that when the course was over, I ended up leaving my job, withdrawing from my graduate school program, and embarking on what was a completely unexpected journey into the heart of American racism. That slide wasn't supposed to be up there yet. Well, you can see what my life looked like. What was so stunning to me in this course was that I discovered that my life was deeply tied to racism. I had no idea. I wondered, how had I missed the clues? I grew up in Winchester, Massachusetts. Many of you probably know, beautiful suburb north of Boston. And this is what my childhood looked a lot like. And this felt completely normal to me because all around me were people who looked and lived like my family. Friends, extended family, characters in my storybooks, even TV families looked and lived like my family. The Brady Bunch, a blended family, this for me was diversity. And what I didn't realize at the time was that constant exposure to people and perspectives so similar to my family's was setting me up to develop a distorted worldview. It was like living in a hall of mirrors, a white bubble. So I have to say, I know not all white bubbles are alike because white American stories vary a lot depending on class, era, religion, geography, among other things. So I want to be clear, I am not speaking for all white Americans. This is my story. And I'm going to focus today specifically on two ideas which were fundamental to the belief system I developed in my particular white bubble. Neither were explicitly articulated to me. They were more built in small moments over time. So the first idea was that America's playing field was level. I heard phrases like land of opportunity, the American dream, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness for all men created equal. I thought that man part was a figure of speech. And I thought all meant all. Okay, the second idea is much, much harder to talk to you about. 7 years ago, I could never have admitted this to you because I couldn't have admitted this to myself. And this is the idea of natural order. The idea that by nature, some people are more worthy, more capable, more fit to lead, and other people are more dangerous, less ambitious, more criminal, less human. And these ideas have a lot to do with race. I know now that natural order is an antiquated idea, and unfortunately I can tell you that it still lives quite actively in my psyche. How did this happen? Well, for instance, everywhere I went, I saw that white men were in charge. And here's where the two ideas interlock. If I think the playing field is level, and I'm repeatedly exposed to images of white men at the top of organizational hierarchies, that sends me a powerful message that white men are superior. That's why they're in charge. Again, we're talking about fleeting moments, phrases that contribute to huge ideas about inherent human difference, huge ideas about social order, social roles, who leads and who follows, who serves and who gets served. Part of the reason these ideas were able to take hold so deeply was because I had no other narratives in my white bubble. I didn't know people with different experiences who probably would have had very different interpretations of all these slides that we're looking at. I so wish someone had helped me explain this, had explained this to me earlier, because without understanding my own inner workings, I ended up spending most of my adult life using my ideas about a level playing field and natural order to reaffirm my ideas about a level playing field and natural order. As a young, I guess I was in my 20s, a job brought me into downtown neighborhoods, downtown Boston neighborhoods, where there were dilapidated buildings and falling apart schools, and invariably these neighborhoods were full of black and brown people. You know these neighborhoods. This is the kind of neighborhood where Michael Brown and Freddie Gray lived and died. And I couldn't bear that this counted for normal for the children in these neighborhoods. So I wanted to do something about it. I came up with a plan. Interestingly, I didn't spend a lot of time talking to the actual people in the actual neighborhoods, because my belief system had already told me that I had little to learn from inferior people about their own circumstances. I mean, in hindsight, it is preposterous, but, you know, I was trapped in my own paradigm, and I didn't know yet that there was an incredibly different explanation for what I was seeing. So I raised money from my white social network, and I created after-school programs and field trips for these disadvantaged children, and then I was really kind of confused when they weren't that appreciative. But that didn't stop me. Not then, and not later when I became a classroom teacher. My patronizing savior syndrome, looks a lot like Scarlett, came with me everywhere I went until the age of 48. So in the first hour of that fateful class, the professor told us, the white professor told us we'd be doing a deep dive into our own racial identity. And I remember looking around the room at my racially mixed cohort and thinking, well, what am I gonna do? I didn't know what I didn't know. About halfway through the course, my belief system was just buckling under the weight of history and narratives that I'd never learned in school or through family stories. And then came the straw that just broke the camel's back. We're watching a film one night, and they were talking about the GI Bill. And I'm thinking, oh, I know the GI Bill, because my dad, he was in World War II, and he used to say that the GI Bill was a great example of how America took care of its own. Right, and he used that GI Bill to go to Harvard Law School for free, and yeah, my parents bought their first home with a loan back, a GI Bill backed loan. Yeah, and all of a sudden the film starts talking about the fact that the GI Bill was not accessible to most of the 1 million black GIs who also laid down their lives in that war. Oh my God. I realized in that moment that racism was not just prejudice. Racism was the power to put prejudice into life-defining laws and policies. And here's how it worked, because racism is a smooth operator. It didn't say anywhere in that bill that black GIs need not apply. Here's how it worked. The federal, at least on the housing front, the Federal Housing Authority, FHA, at the time assessed lending risk on 2 criteria. 1, the condition of a building. 2, the skin color of the residents. Written into FHA guidelines were these words: the presence of even 1 or 2 non-white families could undermine real estate values. So based on this government warning, private banks all across the country created color-coded maps. So a green town, like it would be a Winchester, a white town, and green would designate best lending area. Those areas that I had been calling disadvantaged, thinking people didn't know how to help themselves, those had been outlined in red, designating hazardous lending area. Winchester was not randomly white. Winchester had been made white by intentionally obstructing black and brown people from buying homes there. Okay, so let's see, back to the idea of that American dream. So would we say that education is a critical component of the American dream? And yet in America, most public education is funded by property tax, which is connected to property value, which is at least, and this is still true, connected in part to skin color, which creates wildly divergent educational opportunities along racial lines and produces results that look a lot like natural order. Like white people are awesome, and black and brown people, they're the problem, living off the government, angry, ungrateful, unmotivated. This is such a twisted story, because though I had never thought about it this way, I gotta say, my white family, we got white-only land grants, Social Security, citizenship status, GI Bill benefits, preferential public education, to name a few. And I think about the psychological impact of America's racial scheme on me, because with all those white perks came optimism, a sense of belonging, and the belief that I was safe at the hands of authority. I can't even imagine what the opposite of that feels like. Now, no one alive today created racism. We didn't ask for it. We didn't create it. Yet there is an immense responsibility and opportunity for everyone today to evolve, to use that word, America beyond this archaic and inhumane people scheme. I've had more than a few people of color say to me, Debbie, you're wasting your time. White people know exactly how the system works. They deny it because it works for them. I know those people exist. So I'll push them over there, because I also meet white people every day who are more like me. Good intentions, bad information. Fortunately, not all people of color have given up on white people. This is my colleague, Dr. Eddie Moore, Jr. And in many ways, his childhood was a mirror image of mine, because he grew up in one of those red-lined neighborhoods where he was exposed to negative stereotypes about white people. He got out of that neighborhood, he got to college, where for the first time in his life he met real, live white people and learned that, yeah, there are some hateful white people. And yet there are a lot that just lack education. So Dr. Moore has dedicated his life to educating white people. Among all he's done, one of them is to create the White Privilege Conference, now in its 17th year. So what do we do? This is a huge problem. And yet, all racism begins and ends with individual thoughts, actions, feelings. And so this individual work to think about our own belief systems is a surprisingly crucial piece of moving beyond racism. So I thought what would be helpful would be to share with you 3 of my personal racial justice practices. The first is curiosity. I will always make snap judgments. This is part of being human, but I practice slowing down and asking myself questions like, whoa, why did I just think that thought? Or what's really going on here? Or whose perspective am I not hearing? Courage. You know, I spent most of my life just terrified, especially when it came to talking about race, terrified of saying something stupid, saying something offensive, rocking the boat, creating conflict, and then terrified that I wouldn't be able to handle the fallout if I did any of those things. I can tell you that courage begets courage. It gets easier. Tolerance, okay, misused word in this business. Tolerance is not about me tolerating you, because wouldn't that be setting the bar like pathetically low? Tolerance for me is about me tolerating my own feelings of discomfort as I bumble along imperfectly, discovering new blind spots and feeling anger and grief and embarrassment, the very feelings I was taught to fear and avoid. So this is the thing about finding myself in the story of race. It hasn't just been about connecting to my own racial history. It's been about reconnecting to parts of my own humanity that I had to dumb down in order to not see or feel racism. Racism crushes human potential for all of us. Now, I believe we're all better off when we're all better off. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness for all, you know, that's still my North Star. For every American who can make the time to understand what's behind racial tension, I believe that we'll have an increased chance of pulling together as a nation and as a species. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to bring our panelists back on. I'd like to get your thoughts or reflections following that video. Anything that stood out to you, any highlights that personally resonated?
Yeah, maybe in the video and in the whole conversation that we've been having, so much of what's striking me, I'm a relational therapist, so much of what's striking me is the trauma in this is disconnection. Disconnection from ourselves. Everyone has spoken really beautifully as people trying to work into this, staying connected to our own bodies and what we're feeling, staying connected to our own discomfort and tolerating it, and disconnection from one another. And I believe that disconnection is the essential wound, and that reconnection is what heals. Staying connected to ourselves, staying connected to owning our blind spots, and really being with whoever we're with and whatever we're with, without that automatic armor coming up to protect ourselves and pull us out of the relationship, which is really hard work to tolerate our discomfort and tolerate the wound. At some point, Duran, you tell me when. I want to say a few things specifically to the other white therapists and coaches who are listening about some things that I've learned to think about and that I'd like to pass on.
I think now might be a good time. We have some really good questions in the chat, but we're going to leave that for the last 30 minutes. And I think some of the questions are specifically about how to approach this as a therapist or as someone holding space for marginalized communities. So maybe now would be a great way to just start that conversation.
Great. So as a white male privileged therapist, I would like to empower the other majority therapists to have this courage and curiosity and to stay connected. It's important that we deal with our own shame and move into accountability and go. We talk a lot about white fragility. White fragility is shame, as far as I can see, and the defense against that shame. And just like we teach our clients to move from shame to accountability and guilt, same thing for us. If someone calls us out about something we've said or done that's imperfect or insensitive or harmful, we have to move out of our own fragility and shame into accountability. We have to learn how to hold ourselves in warm regard in the face of encountering our imperfections on this topic. As privileged folks, it isn't if I say something that's insensitive or difficult or harmful, it's when I say something that's, it's just like locating ourselves. I think it's important to predict that there'll be tough moments. I've been at this for a while. Duran, you've been with me for a while now. I mean, I can't believe the things that still come out of my mouth to this day. I was doing a timeout, describing how you do a timeout to a couple of color. And I said, like I say, to everybody, because it's everybody. Yeah, and if your partner bars the door and won't let you take a time out, call the police. And the young black man said, excuse me. And it was like, I can't believe that came out. Oh yeah, call your friendly cop about a domestic violence. That's a brilliant idea. But it's just like the blind spots. So our imperfections as majority therapists are inevitable. Own them, predict them, and use our relational skills when they show up. Lean into them. And don't be petrified of somebody's reaction. There's a lot of womb here. And if you open up to being willing to let the feelings of that wound enter into the therapeutic space with you, they will. And this is where your boundaries come in and where your self-esteem comes in. And it's okay. Nobody's going to die. It's central to all relationships. They're about harmony, disharmony, and repair. When those imperfections come up, we can use the skills of repair if the person we're speaking to wants to. And we have a lot to say about how healing can occur. And it's all about what I've heard all through this whole conversation. It's all about being present and staying with instead of opting out to protect yourself, which is hard work and not work to do alone, but get support from others and learn. So a ton more to say, but if we're talking about shame resilience as a privileged white therapist, let's talk about managing our own shame so that we can step into accountability and be of use to people when these dynamics show up.
Yeah.
Michelle? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on the video and kind of, yes, Terry, I agree. I don't want to disregard anything you said. I totally agree. And glad that you added that. And I'm really curious to hear kind of what Michelle thinks about the video and how it ties into this conversation.
I think what I found most helpful, one was her willingness to tell her story and not protect herself, to say the things that she really thought on a very public forum. And I think to do this work well, we all have to be willing to do that, to bring our whole selves, the real things, the messy things into the conversation. In terms of tools at the end, when she was talking about empathy and tolerance of our own discomfort and courage. I think those are things that we all need to exercise. I know I will be honest, for me, there were moments that felt, I think this differentiation sometimes between if I'm a good white person who's willing to lean in versus the ones who aren't, if I'm the good Black person who's willing to teach and to that I think sometimes misses the point. I think even our packaging around what it means to be nice and to be good activates a lot of our shame language. For me, I find it really helpful. I love Channing Austin Brown's work around how nice is really not the central concept. If we acknowledge that harm is happening, then even right now, as we're talking about what are these internal physics that get in my way from entering into the work, it's not just so that I can feel calm and be nicer and friendlier to people. It's either that I am working to regulate myself and my own system so that I can create change, so that I can break down things in systems that keep people from being able to be their full self. If I'm not about the business of breaking down the harm in systems, and this is just about how do we feel more comfortable and be nicer and friendlier to each other, then it's kind of missing the point altogether. And so I do think, and I think this is even coming up a little bit in the questions, that it's different work. What shame shields and armor come up for me when I'm working for parts of myself that hold more privilege and power, being cisgender, being heterosexual, holding a PhD, some of those things. There's different armor and things that I have to work with there than when I'm talking about being Black or a woman. And so knowing for myself what is coming up and how do I work with those things, because my values are to get out of my own way so that we can break down these things that allow us all to have more wholeness, health, and to be able to sit in the discomfort that it takes to do that. So I think, like anything in that video, I think it's a little bit older. I know for myself, sometimes even in DEI work, I can freeze up about not wanting to say anything because I'm afraid that in that moment, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, the language will be wrong or this or that. And so it does require us putting out something that is imperfect so that we can build on it and take the next step.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that perspective. Definitely an important addition. Rebecca?
Yeah, as I was listening to the video, a lot came up, but I particularly was thinking about some recent conversations with leadership clients when they were just kind of bullet pointing a lot like the speaker did, all like just expanding, pulling back the curtain on systemic racism and the depths of the harm that has been done and is continuing to be done. And a reflex action to, what do I got to do to fix it? I got to fix this. What's my part? I got to. And so slowing and saying that fast, but slowing that down to realizing, let's sit with what you're seeing first. But the reflex to let me go shut down whatever's uncomfortable so I feel better is really not what they think they're doing or they believe it. But I think we also, with shame resilience, feeling through what shame comes up, what guilt comes up, and then moving into deep grief and lament and recognizing that this is going to be an ongoing process. And when I'm in grief and lament, there's nothing cool and put together. And whiteness likes that, like it's tidy, it's organized. And there's a lot of fear that comes up with folks, particularly in white bodies, around perception and fear of doing the wrong thing or not doing enough. And it's more about getting clear on what's driving your desire to be a part of this conversation, to be a part of this change. And sometimes it's going, wow, I want to be a good white person. Okay. And I want to be a part of this. So slowly unpacking your motivations, getting clear of those motivations, constantly checking that in. Because when people are hurting, we want them to not hurt, so we don't hurt, especially those we care about. With this issue, it's a lot of, even though I wasn't a part of that happened a long time ago. A lot of those really not okay statements. It's recognizing not to distance from it, not to come in to fix it or to be a savior, and to get clear on the meaning and the motivation of what's coming up, and also make room for another difficult emotion, and that is grief. And so that's what I'm just thinking about too, because a lot of folks are used to, with their startups, their entrepreneurs, or therapists who are doing their reps day in and day out, sitting with people. It's how can I help? How can I help? And it's slowing down the process and getting really clear on the meaning and the motivation of what's coming up and what they want to do about change. And sometimes that's some humbling and convicting internal reflections on that. But what's so cool is when they do that pause and check in, the work that does end up being forward facing can be so powerful and impactful, even when it doesn't feel enough.
Can I just
Yeah.
say something?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Michelle. Yeah.
I wanted to say something too about even our strategy sometimes when we're doing DEI work, because I think sometimes we're trying to do a lot in limited space. So I fully agree with what Rebecca is saying about these, the need for spaces for grief. And I think sometimes what happens is we have a DEI space where you have people, let's say if we're talking about race, you have people who are Black and you have people of color in the room. And if the space then centers white people's grief, it leaves BIPOC people sitting there kind of trying to figure out, what am I doing here? What is my role here? And I think that those spaces are needed. I think sometimes we have to be really intentional about what are we centering and what are our goals, because sometimes I think we take on trying to solve all the problems in 2 hours and then do harm.
Yep.
Similarly, I would say, for example, like with something you brought up, Joanne, earlier about, often DEI work is being done in our achievement spaces. So if I'm an executive, if I'm an academic, whatever space, these are the spaces where I've been really rewarded for showing up as together. And so I'm going to have to know that when I show up in that space, I'm going to want to use the same tools that I've used, my cognitive abilities. That's what I've been rewarded for in that space, my not vulnerability. And so I have to know that, and I think we have to be really intentional and create understandings and agreements that allow people to be intentional about laying some of those tools down and being clear about what they're going to tool up with in those spaces. I know for myself, when we talk about additional spaces that we need, sometimes if I'm going to, especially as a Black woman, walk into a space and be vulnerable and put down the need to always know and get it right and prove myself, I've got to also have other spaces that I can go to where I can really root in my belonging, where people see me, where they can, where they just get me and reflect back to me my inherent worthiness. So I think it's an important question for us to ask ourselves when we go into these DEI spaces. Do we even have the spaces that we would need outside of there to process all the things that come up? Or are we trying to do that all in that space, which often backfires because there's too many different kinds of needs in the room?
Oh, that is so spot on, Michelle. I would say, personally, I relate to that because, I think the only reason I can do this work is because I have a whole community behind me. Like I always say, when George Floyd was murdered and I was going to all of these meetings and people were telling me that they needed me to help craft messages and et cetera, it was my own community that actually helped me grieve, and that held space for me personally. So I think it's really important to understand something that Rebecca kind of touched on, are wanted and unwanted identities. We talk about that a lot in Daring Way and Brené's work. And so I remember, I had done that work maybe 2 or 3 years before George Floyd died, and I reverted back to looking at that. What is it that I'm so afraid of not being? I think of shame as a very social, emotional experience, if you will. We're trying to look good for somebody. We're trying to be something to someone. And going back to what Michelle was kind of referring to in my perspective, for a lot of people of color or marginalized people, queer people, differently abled people, they might be showing up from a place of code switching because that's how they got there. In order for me to survive the military experience, to be a Black woman in the military, especially at the top, of the rank structure, I had to know the language, I had to know the culture and navigate to what was expected of me. And so many of us get into that realm of this is what's expected of me. I'll share another kind of personal experience. I realized recently that, so I'm a divorced woman. I've been dating. A lot of people follow me on social media about that experience as well. And I realized that shame resilience really shows up in my dating experience. Even who I'm open to dating, what I'm telling myself about how that person perceives me, because dating is very vulnerable. But I've been recently interracially dating for the first time ever. I've kind of embraced, the openness of who knows, love is love, and whoever loves me, that's who I want to share love with. And to have more of a relational, intimate, experience, I need to be open and honest about, the hangups that I've had racially as well. And so I've had conversations with the white men that I've dated, and it's really been a corrective, reparative experience in many ways, because we're sharing stories with each other that maybe we've never shared with anyone else, such as, what was my fear of dating interracially for over 40 years? What was, they're often wondering, for many of the white men that I dated, they've been married to Black women in the past, they have Black children. So they've been in this world of Blackness, and they fully embraced their parts that might have struggled with that. And so I'm kind of new to that experience and wondering, what kept me back? So it was the unwanted identity of not being Black enough. Serena Williams, she got a lot of Black women who've dated interracially. I've seen over, generations over generations. Maya Angelou, she married and dated interracially. But there's been a lot of shame associated with that for us as Black women, that you're not down enough, or you're not dedicated enough, or you're not committed to Black love. So I had to ask myself, what was the fear there? And the fear was that I was going to be disconnected from my community. That if I even mention that this might be something that I'm interested in, there might be some shame there. So when we talk about shame, it's a really social emotion, and we're usually thinking of someone or something or some entity or some collective rule or norm that we don't want to break, because we don't want to be disconnected from people who have accepted us or who we feel like we belong to. And so I often now ask myself, when I feel shame and I'm able to catch myself in that moment, I'll ask myself, who am I putting on a pedestal? Really, whose desires and needs and wants have become more important than my own in my own life? And so that's a question or a thought that I will invite everyone else to consider when you find yourself saying, I should do this or I should not do that. Who is it that you're actually putting on a pedestal? And oftentimes it may be society, the legacy burdens that we've all taken in. And it looks like Rebecca wants to say a lot. So I want to kind of hear from you again, but these are all things that we have to, just navigate in our experiences and kind of rumble with, as you mentioned before.
I just want to say quickly, if I may. We think of shame individualistically. It's about me. But if grandiosity is better than, and shame is less than, the question you raised, Duran, is less than who? Shame is always relational. Less than who? There's always somebody on the other side of that seesaw that I'm feeling less than to. So even something as individualistic as shame that we think of as my problem with me is always me juxtaposed against something or someone that I either think is judging me or better than me or about to exclude me. So I just want to underline what you said, and the way out is letting go of that comparison, that great AA sentence, compare and despair. I don't give a damn about whoever's better than. In the book, central to RLT is what I call coming out from the great lie, that one person or a group could be essentially superior or inferior to another. That is a delusion that hurts all of us. So I love your coaching, Shane, in a relational perspective. I'm not better or less than anyone. I'm simply who I am, period, end of story. I just wanted to say that. I know we want to get to Rebecca, but
Yeah, I really learned to embody that through the dating experience, because I kind of got to a point where I realized, oh, I'm pedestalizing white men. I'm making them more than human, or, like I started to realize, like, by saying this person is off limits to me, I was almost saying that I'm not good enough for that. And as I've gotten to know them on a very human, personal, intimate level, I realize they're human beings with similar insecurities as everyone else, but sometimes our internalized white supremacy culture tells us that there's certain people who are untouchable, who don't have normal basic human experiences such as shame. And I had to remind myself that when I right-size myself with all the humans on the planet, we all experience, emotions and vulnerability and difficulties in life. So Rebecca, yes, let's kind of hear more about what you're thinking.
Just lots of amen. That's probably what you're seeing me. I'm probably just, my body is like wanting to jump up and down with a lot of what you were sharing. And I had a mentor several years ago say, whatever you think about the most is what you worship. Whoever or whatever you think about the most is what you worship. And is that worthy of that kind of adulation? And I kind of use it as a check-in, when, especially depending on how I'm feeling, is what's consuming my thoughts? What am I elevating? Who or what am I elevating? And that's a great check-in to see who I'm giving my power to, and if I'm externalizing my worthiness to others or those who aren't worthy of it. Because those whose opinions like deeply, deeply matter are pretty small in my life. And while I care, I'm not a believer in the I don't give any F's kind of, that's also a lobotomy, but to diminish who is getting the majority of my values and my thought life and my attention is important. I also want to circle back on the grief piece, and Michelle touched on this briefly. I trained with Resmaa Menakem for last year, and had the privilege of being in a white affinity space, and learned a lot about the value of affinity spaces. And when I first was put into one in a different experience, it brought up a lot of not pleasant feelings. But understanding the power of affinity spaces in the spaces I move in, the spaces that I lead, but also especially with a grief and lament. I've learned from so many of my friends and colleagues of color that my tears can often even feel manipulative and do harm. And I want to name that, knowing that a lot of folks will, but my pain is real. And yes, but really being sensitive to the space and the community, because a lot of harm has been done. A lot of folks it's been done, weaponized, and done an immense amount of harm. At the same time, real grief, real lament, it feels different and is essential to continuing to do this work. So yeah, those are some of the thoughts that are on my mind.
I'm so glad you brought that up. One of the things I think about often when, the whole idea of Karens and entitled white women feeling entitled to safety and security and protection at all costs. And when you brought up the tears, white women's tears, as we refer to it often in the BIPOC communities, but I always have to remind people that white woman's tears is what caused Emmett Till to lose his life. Simply a white woman being appalled for being whistled at, and he was brutally murdered, where his mother had to, see his body extremely disfigured. If you don't know the story, and if he was alive today, he would only be in his 60s. So we think these things happened a long time ago. We want to, shame wants us to deny and push things away, and not embrace the truth of what our country is founded on and what happened not so long ago that's still living in our bodies. Right. So that is kind of just another context when we say, Karen behavior or white women's entitlement. We're talking about the entitlement of being able to cry out and receive help or support from strangers. That's not a privilege that someone like myself has ever had in this life. So understanding that privilege and unpacking that, I think, is really important. Mm-hmm. So Michelle, did you have more to add, or?
I was just going to say a point that Kenneth Hardy made that just was so clarifying to me, is that he was like, reconnecting with our emotions is important across all identities. And so a white woman crying in a DEI space is not a problem. Decentering the whole conversation, which is often what happens. I think that's what you're naming, Joanne, is that there is a power that gets leveraged. And if that is named, and that it's like, okay, you can be there in that discomfort, and the process can continue. The central problem that we're here to address can still happen. And so I think that's a distinction, because I don't think anybody's saying don't reconnect with your feelings, because the grief is helpful, which is why we need those spaces. But it becomes a use of power, how it works when it derails where the process, the conversation, the problem solving was going.
Yeah, I think
Yes.
that's really important too, Michelle, because a lot of folks in white bodies then get a little even more disoriented when they, how to care for their grief. But what does it mean to not center themselves in that process in a mixed space room? And that is the work. And so that's where I think then that's where whiteness kind of can come up so quickly of what I have my feelings too. I and being able to attune to how we care for our genuine, real emotion and still center the important focus and topic at hand. It involves a lot of work, but sometimes that is requires a lot of individual or affinity space group. And affinity meaning, regardless, it can be with an identity you hold, whether it's race, it could be sexual identity, gender, there's so many different ways to do affinity spaces. But staying curious about impact is an important thing, while also attuning and attending to real needed emotions. That is, I feel like, an important responsibility for many of us who've been able just to do what we want, how we want, even if we haven't felt that way. There's just certain privileges that many folks who hold privileged identities have been able to hold. And it's a very complicated and heated conversation to navigate and work through. And one that I appreciate having in smaller groups, smaller affinity groups, or individually, so that when hard conversations happen in mixed group settings, people can still tend to the emotion without decentering important conversations or focuses.
Yeah. So now it's time for our Q&A. I checked briefly the chat in the Q&A section and saw that we have some really good questions, actually. So I'm kind of one of the questions I saw was referring to what you just mentioned, Rebecca, kind of dissociation is what that is, to really name that. And that's what I've had to do too, when I'm not in my body, when I'm not aware of the experience and I'm not present. I was a chronic dissociator in my childhood. I have a lot of trauma, as many of you know. And I can dissociate by talking. I can dissociate by intellectualizing. It's really just me coming away from the experience, right? Mentally and emotionally, and energetically in my body. So let's go to the Q&A, and I can read the question, I think, specifically, and have the panelists weigh in on their thoughts. Yeah, so this was an anonymous comment/question. It says, I think it's unfair to say that someone who doesn't feel vulnerable is a zombie when it's actually dissociation. As someone who was locked in dissociation and compartmentalization for many years, ditto. I'm so grateful for the support I got to move into co-regulation and help. I'd still be stuck there if I had been rejected as subhuman. So again, that some people call it relational privilege or nervous system privilege. Having people that you can safely co-regulate, that you trust to because trust is one of the biggest casualties, if you will, when we're not able to be vulnerable. So the ability to be vulnerable and trust that someone else will be there to support you is one of the reasons why I've been so excited about our partnership with Relational Life Therapy. Because a lot of Black and Brown women, especially, we haven't been given space to really, like I said, take up space in the first place, and then to trust that space will be held and will be honored and cherished. That can in itself be a privilege for some people.
I was going
ahead.
to say there too, because I know I took what Rebecca said and took kind of the metaphor one step further. And I think any metaphor you have to be careful with taken too far. So I think in saying it, I definitely didn't want to refer to people who are experiencing dissociation, different defenses or strategies as being separate. I think I actually was trying to speak more to sometimes my experience of not even being able to see what's running me, like in internal family systems, like I have parts that have kind of stepped to the forefront that are keeping me from seeing other things and that are almost kind of driving my behavior out of my awareness. But I think that's a hugely human thing and not at all a subhuman thing. And I could see how that would not be in some ways a great fit there.
Yeah, I just want to, since I initiated the metaphor, I always have to be careful. And my intent, which wasn't the impact, was to more talk about the caricatures we see in the movies, and having a deep, not even thinking of any human quality, any human has to do what they have to do to survive, and have a deep reference for that. So my apologies on how that metaphor landed, and appreciate the comment.
Yeah. So here's another one that I think maybe the two of you, both Rebecca and Michelle, could speak to. It says, are you able to speak to somatic abolitionism and shame resilience? It's kind of that intersection, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I can just briefly say for myself, when I look at shame resilience, I think one of Brené's many gifts is the ability to name things, measure them, come up with tools, show us what's useful, give us language to then come together and figure out how do we process and move through things. To me, what somatic abolitionism and other tools, and there's tons of them, like tons of the somatic ways that people of color and Indigenous people have used their bodies to process trauma forever. There's lots of different somatic and embodied approaches. But to me, I think what that body of work did was to highlight how race and all of the isms are stuck in our body and begin to give us embodied ways of moving that through us, loosening, holding the discomfort. So I think that I see the two as really complementary. And I actually think I use a lot of different tools kind of up underneath the shame resilience to get it down into the body and moving different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And I would just add, Resma and his team did a beautiful job in our group, which was all white bodies or white adjacent or white identifying bodies. So there was a layer to that training and an awareness that I learned how we can often say and do things because of the bodies that we're in, and to be mindful of that, and also get aware of the experiences of folks who have different identities or in different bodies, and just to be respectful of that, and how particularly we can blow through spaces even with the best of intentions. So was a really powerful experience, and I see them inextricably connected for me too.
Okay, thank you. We have a question that I thought maybe Terry, you might be best for answering. I want to make sure I word it correctly. So it says, how do I move through the shame of choosing to stay with a partner who significantly betrayed me? Or betrayed you. And I think this is an important question because those same relational dynamics, power dynamics tend to show up across all of our lives. If we're chronically in a one down place of shame for any reason, that might bleed over into your parenting or professional life. So what are your thoughts on this question? How do I move through the shame of choosing to stay with a partner who significantly betrayed you?
As Sarah Farrell talks about this, she talks about the new shame, which is taking the son of a gun back after they've betrayed you. The issue is, are they still betraying you? If you're still being mistreated and abusively treated, and then I would say your shame may be trying to tell you something, why am I still here enacting a one down position to somebody who's enacting a one up position? It's like pain. Your physical pain is a signal that maybe something ain't right. So you might want to listen to that. If, on the other hand, the person who betrayed you it has moved into some level of recovery, is accountable, is remorseful, has learned, and wants to step into a more healthy and mature relationship with you, then you have to lean in to the shaming voices that are telling you it's disrespectful to even forgive the person. And let yourself be relational with them. So I think it has to do with what's in front of you. If what's in front of you is still toxic, then it's not about I'm a bad person for putting up with this, but it is about maybe I need to ask myself some questions about why I'm not being more self-respecting and exercising better self-care. If the person is available and healthy and ready to love you in a mature way, then it's about letting go of the past, dealing with the injury, and allowing repair to happen. And in our individualistic, self-righteous culture, there will be a lot of support for ditch the creep. They did you dirty, and you know, a self-respecting woman would be done with them. Once a cheater, always a cheater. But as a relational therapist, I prefer connection and repair over self-righteous indignation. I respect people's right to protect themselves when there's something that needs to be protected. But if the danger is gone, then maybe it's time to allow yourself to open your heart and feel good about it, not bad about it.
All right. I have another question for Terry, actually. So this one says, I believe that I grew up, I can speak to it as well, but says, I believe that I grew up with shame as both a Black woman, but also greatly influenced by religion. I can so second that. If you grew up in Texas and you were in church 5 times a week, like I was, you know, growing up for most of my life, most of my childhood, there tends to be a lot of shame. And what I've learned, and I'll go on with the question, but it's patriarchy and religion. You know, there's a lot, they have a lot of connections and underpinnings. So, you know, that's something to keep in mind. Shame towards women specifically when it comes to a lot of the religious teaching. So, but this person says, I believe that I grew up with shame as both a Black woman, but also greatly influenced by religion. Shame has been my supposed tool to humility. By living in shame, I would never fall into hubris. While I intellectually understand this is inaccurate, I am still gripped. How can RLT speak to this?
You have a God-given right to be on this planet. You have a God-given right to take up space. And I believe it is your birthright to be in a cherishing relationship in which you can cherish and be cherished. And anything less than that, including the way you treat yourself, is no gift to anybody, including God. So you're so right, Duran. Religion, there's so much misogyny in organized religion. And I like to scan for those moments that we don't get taught in church or synagogue or mosque that support a more humanistic view. If I may, as a Jew, Carol Gilligan, the great feminist, taught me this. We all know that Eve was created out of Adam's rib to comfort him. But the actual Hebrew is Eve was made out of Adam's rib to comfort him by opposing him. That gets lost. So there's a lot of more progressive elements to religion, but we have to look. When I work with a faith-based couple, and they say to me, the Bible says man should be the head of the household. I say, oh, okay, well, let's talk about what a Christ-like head of the household would look like. And it doesn't look like you, my friend. So we can go back to our religious roots if it means something to us and find more progressive elements in them. But they're probably not what you were taught in Sunday school. stand up to that shame and reclaim your God-given right to have dignity and worth on this planet. Shame is no favor to anybody. Somebody once said to me, they walked out of church and everybody was breaking their arms, congratulating themselves on how humble they were. I don't think that anybody needs that kind of humility, including the spirit. Forget it.
Yes. And this goes to one of the questions someone asked us to kind of define an affinity space. And most of the trainings that we partner with at Black Therapists Rock are primarily affinity spaces, meaning that they're predominantly Black and we center the issues of Black people because there aren't many places that actually hold space in that way for us. And so the training that we have coming up next month in October here in the DC area is going to be an opportunity for a lot of us as Black women, especially, to look at those things and to talk about them together. Because kind of what Terry was saying earlier, connection is what dispels shame. And Brene says that shame dies when stories are told. So just the fact that you can say that in this setting and have that held and honored and validated is what we need more of in our own healing work and in our collective as well. So I love this question from someone named Jamila. It says, do you think racism and the exclusion of persons in the outgroup is about competing and controlling resources and the fear of being without those resources? I would say a wholehearted yes, especially where we are in our country right now. People are holding on to power as if their lives depend on it. And as if their legacies of domination depend on it oftentimes. So from my perspective, absolutely. And I think that it's also a fear of if, the people who have never been in power, if they happen to become powerful, what's going to happen? I think there's a lot of fear around empowering marginalized people, empowering queer people, empowering, disabled people, all types of people, women, there's a lot of fear around women being empowered, which is so ironic to me. Very interesting and very telling. So I would love to hear what the other panelists think. How does fear really work itself into this conversation? And what are some strategies that we can help people with when those fears come up in their bodies?
I guess where I would just start is, I also wholeheartedly agree. And I think a lot of times we don't even know that there's an alternative. We don't know that there's an alternative to hyper-individualism and scarcity and competition. We don't realize that we were really built and wired for interdependence, that like collectivism, that we really can all win. And so I think beginning to, and a lot of this maybe for me is coming from an internal family systems point, is to begin to notice the parts in me that hold that fear, how they react to that fear. And, even from the shame resilience, like where did I get these? And being exposed to different frameworks, different ways of being, and beginning to get support around what does it look like to try something different. And I think for a lot of us, these are not the prevailing ways that we've been taught to be. We haven't been taught to believe that my liberation is inherently tied to everyone else's, that I can't be fully free unless everybody else. And if I believe that to be true, then I insist on us all getting it. But that's an exercise in faith. It's an exercise in giving up the survival strategies that say, like, no, let me go run and grab all the toilet paper for myself because I'm afraid there's not going to be enough for all of us. When in fact, like, we know there isn't enough housing for people, there is enough food for people, but it requires us changing in our bodies, our values, and how we hold that.
Yeah, I second all of what you said. And briefly, I want to recommend a book called Decolonizing Wealth by Victor Villanueva that is phenomenal. That is kind of all out of this conversation, but in the spaces of philanthropy and wealth. So it's highly recommend it. And for me, it's making sure that I check in with my fear and I witness it, I slow down and not lead from it. And sometimes I catch that a little too late, probably more often than I want to admit. And my system, when I check in, often gives me a little space when I remind myself that I have choices, even if all the choices on the table are not ideal, but that I'm not trapped. And that's really helpful. And really watching some basic stuff too. Who or what is feeding my fear? And how is that aligned with my values? And how is that helping and supporting me practicing resilience? And then checking in with my fear, because fear is a powerful and important hardwired biological protector. What is it that my fear needs to tell me? What does it need to know that I know? And really listening to that. And then staying curious if my fear is requiring me to dehumanize myself or others in the process of trying to protect. That is something that it can happen so quickly, and it takes a lot of reps and a lot of time. But I often find a lot of fears for me and those that I work with come from feeling trapped. And once there's a sense of agency, even if a little bit of breathing room helps, and then getting really curious about the fears, particularly the specific fears and the meaning and motivation behind them, and seeing what's aligned and what's not, and taking there. And that often requires support outside of me. It takes a beat to metabolize fear. And it also can be that place where it feels like, I don't know, feels powerful. Like there's just something about it. And I've learned just to kind of really practice slowing down. And that also is really key. Slowing down. Again, I keep repeating this, but witnessing the fear and getting to know it often will help offer some more space too.
Yeah, I also think in our culture, especially in our hyper individualistic culture here in the United States of America, a lot of us have kind of pushed our fears so deep down, like we have been told to be tough and, bold and brave all the time, courageous, non-human. And I think that we're not aware when we're scared. We're not even, we don't pay attention. We just override it. And it reminds me of Erikson's developmental model when he talks about, I think it's at 3 years old, somewhere between 2 to 4, that's a phase where we're going through and we're learning to say no for the first time to our parents. It becomes our favorite word when we're toddlers. And that no, if it's not respected, if it's not heard, if it's not valued, if it's not honored ever, then what Erikson said is that we go into shame. And I think many of us are operating from scared little toddlers, oftentimes in politics on very public stages, right? And someone else wanted us to talk a little bit about narcissism, but that's how I see narcissism. I often see it as the part of us who wants to get its way all the time, wants more, mine, and many, not enough, right? And also, as you were talking, Michelle, I thought about scarcity mindset. How, when there's not enough, when we're constantly telling ourselves that there's not enough and there will never be enough, that is going to perpetuate fear. That automatically is going to take us into that scared toddler place. And so I know that, in 12 steps, we say fear stands for fuck everything and run. It's very primitive, excuse my language. It's very hair on fire. So I'm wondering, Terry, I know that RLT has some strategies for working with our adaptive child. If we see it as a scared child who needs some support, needs help, or just needs some assistance, what would be a recommendation for when we're in that fearful place and we're not sure what to do?
I want to say so much of the rhetoric, I think of Mandela and the dismantling of apartheid, and so much of the privileged fear is that they're going to do to us what we've done to them. Once we give them power, then we're going to be the oppressed ones, and they're going to be the oppressors. And I think that learning to be relational, look, we need a new paradigm, the paradigm of power over. Whether you're the one down one or the one up one, is killing our planet. We're all going to die if we keep up with this paradigm. We have to, adaptation means you adjust to what's in front of you. Okay, hair on fire. What's in front of us is we're going to burn up this planet in a few generations if we don't change our paradigm. We have to move from power over, power under to being with nature, being with this planet, being with other human beings who don't look like us, moving out of an exclusive privileged position, not in a way of, oh my God, I'm going to die, but in a way that's this system is killing all of us, and it's in all of our interests to move into something ecological. You know, it's an interesting both and, because as a privileged person, it's dicey to speak about what the poison that privilege has done to me, because it pales in comparison to the horror us privileged folks have inflicted on others. Nevertheless, you can't be racist and not be dissociative. You cannot be connected and otherize another human being at the same time. These are costs to our own humanity. And if we don't learn to put ourselves in the system rather than above the system, then we're all going to die. So if you want to be afraid, let's be afraid of what we should be afraid of, not power sharing or sharing resources. How about if we don't learn to be relational, the consequences are all around us right now today, and they're only going to get worse. So let's adapt to what's in front of us by shifting out of this paradigm and face our fears. In RLT, we say, let the bad thing happen. Let it happen and let's deal with it. But the way we've been going, power and privilege, marginalization, one up, one down, is killing everybody. It's in all of our interests to work beyond it. And when we get frayed, remember that. It's in my interest to disassemble this, because it's killing me and my kids and grandkids.
Great way to end. So I want to bring back Sarah, the person who's helped coordinate all of this, and she's going to close us out. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. What a rich conversation. Thank you all for being here and participating in this. And thank you for everyone who sent in great questions. I know we did not get to tend to all your questions live, and we didn't get to answer all your questions written. I'll try to capture them and share them with our panelists, but it's time to wrap up. We didn't get to them all. So thank you all for being here. And Duran, thank you for leading such an insightful conversation.
Mm-hmm.
This is the third part of a 4-part series. They're all hosted by Duran Young. And the next one will happen on December 5th, where Terry Real will again join Duran Young and 2 other guest panelists for a conversation on the stages of change. Because you are all here today, anyone who registered for this event will automatically get registered and notified about that event. And we appreciate it if you share this event. The recording will come out in a few weeks once it's edited, and we'll be sending out that link to anyone who's interested. You can make a donation and have access to the recording. And if you can share it with your community, anyone you think would benefit from it, it's greatly helpful to our organization, Relational Life Foundation, in doing more of this work. So, to learn more about Duran, Michelle, Rebecca, and Terry, I will have Tyler share a slide now that I prepared where their websites are listed. We also want to thank our ASL interpreters, Derek and Beth. Really helpful to have you both here. This event is sponsored by Relational Life Foundation. We're a nonprofit organization, and your donations make our work possible. Check us out. We appreciate every single dollar gifted, even if it's $5, it helps. Every time you share one of our offerings, and every single one of you who volunteers to support us. You can get involved with us at relationallifefoundation.org, and we will be in touch with you. Can't wait to see you again. Thanks, everyone.
Mm.